What skills do you believe a high-caliber director should possess?
I like to think of those under three headings, really: science, politics, and intuition. If we think about how business schools for the last 50 years have taught leadership, I could describe it like this. They've taught be numerate, be quantitative, get evidence, that's the spreadsheet, and then do something intuitive that makes everyone inspired and sing from the same hymn sheet. So I would say the business school view of leadership for 50 years has been from spreadsheet to hymn sheet. There's two problems with that. One is it doesn't work very well. A lot of people struggle at how do I take this analytical stuff and make people get inspired. But the whole thing leaves political skill completely out of the question. Virtually every analysis I've read of what went wrong in our banks and financial institutions around the world says that an absolutely essential part of the remedy is more effective challenge in the boardroom, better governance. People are asking, why did the non-execs of that company not challenge that acquisition or that expansion of property lending? That is a question about challenge and conflict. Where are people going to learn the skills of challenging and conflict that they're going to bring to the boardroom if politics has not been part of their understanding of growing as a leader?
What would you say distinguishes a good leader?
Well, I think leadership is fundamentally about relationships and the ability to engage with a very diverse base of stakeholders and navigate through, I think, some of the very challenging external circumstances that we find ourselves in, is certainly the things that we're looking for in quality leaders.
One of the most quoted kind of attributes of leadership is, being able to make those great speeches, those powerful, stirring words. And at least in Britain, where I come from, people often think back to Churchill. But if you go back and look at Churchill's war speeches as a wartime prime minister, up to 3/4 of his speech was describing the facts, often of a very bleak military situation, a defeat, Dunkirk, Norway, or what have you. And only at the end, only when he had people believing that they had a leader who really understood the reality of the situation at the end, came the few sentences of hope, the few sentences that are now quoted endlessly. So I think a good leader absolutely has got to give people hope, but before you give people hope, they've got to recognize that they're on the same planet as you.
And I think really interesting is that there's a groundswell at the moment, and I think social media has a lot to do with that, where individuals are starting to push up and say these are the attributes we're looking for in our leaders, and transparency and trust, and the ability to lead and navigate in very complex situations are some of the attributes that are coming through from people within organizations.
How's the increase on demands from corporate governance and regulatory frameworks affected the board's focus on intuition and politics?
I think that there's been a mixed result. I mean, on the one hand, the strong regulatory challenge, but not just the regulatory challenge, the genuine desire of most boards themselves not to repeat what are now seen as major mistakes, means that people are trying to think, how do we think the unthinkable? How do we ask questions which we didn't ask before? And that kind of opens up some new possibilities to introduce reflection on the politics of the board and the intuition. But I think there's also some quite negative consequences, that the strong regulatory impetus also leads boards to just be very process-bound and to be cautious that in a way isn't very safe.
Closer scrutiny by executives on the board or board members of executives will in fact lead to more effective boards and will also lead to an early warning system, which is really what the board should be looking at. We should be knowing about challenges and crises before they happen.
I think one of the dimensions is about the diversity in the boardroom itself. And again, we see, at least in Britain, for example, a split effect. We see increased attention to the desirability of having more women and people with diverse professional as well as other types of background on the board. And yet at the same time, some of the reports into the crisis, such as the Walker report, said, oh, the reason that the board didn't ask enough tough banking questions was that not enough members of the board were bankers. So those two pull slightly in different directions. I personally think that increased diversity, including gender diversity, is key.
And certainly diversity here, I think in South Africa we've considered diversity very much about race and gender. And in actual fact, I think it's often about having a variety of skills and capabilities that create a well-rounded board that is effective to challenge. Because in an executive team, you're looking for harmonious relationships. In a board environment, you're looking for the ability to question and challenge.
And the ability to also understand what it's like to be a customer, particularly in retail organisations.
In South Africa, we've worked quite hard with diversity. Do you feel that we're still struggling with diversity in terms of gender?
I think certainly from a gender perspective, look, we're at the forefront of gender diversity on boards. You know, if you look at the most recent numbers, we did a comparison recently at the JSE to FTSE and Nasdaq, and we lead the way by a couple of percentage points, at least 5. But that still only amounts to sort of 16%. And there are still 30% of the JSE top listed companies that have no women on their boards. I think while we might be leading the pack, it's a rather dismal pack.
Yes.
And of course there's lots of work to do. And, certainly the Nordic countries seem to have got it right, but of course they've legislated. And in South Africa we've got very progressive legislation around gender. And that's of course also led to quite a rapid rise. But that being said, there's a lot more work to do.